Attention listeners, ahead are spoilers.
Hello, and welcome to the Movie Trap. My name is Russell Carlsen, and with me, as always, Chris Boroff.
I speak mostly English.
And with me as well, Zach Powers.
In Soviet Russia, steroids take you!
Welcome to the Movie Trap. On the Movie Trap, for those unfamiliar, one of the three hosts you just met picks a theme, and then each of the other hosts picks a movie based off that theme. Once we've watched all three movies, we then vote with an allocated amount of points, plus some bonus points we get to divvy out along the way. And then whichever host's movie wins the vote, that host gets to pick the next theme. And we are right in the middle of Chris Boroff's theme of a slightly nebulous theme of genre shifts of what we've kind of leaning with here.
Movies that change somewhere in the middle of the film from
in
one...
In the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So kind of hard to nail down, and we've been we'll explore a lot of that in the coming couple episodes.
That's the trap
as we did with the last episode. Mm-hmm. Indeed.
No, it's a good topic. It's tough to think about.
It's definitely it's a sticky trap because as we previously on the Movie Trap found out, we watched 1971's Performance, which was Chris Boroff's pick since it's his theme, and that was an experience of itself. This week's episode is going to be my pick, and it is the 2017 documentary Icarus, which is, on a pin note, basically just about doping in sports. So before we get into the fun, the very intriguing and shady world of organized sports, let's get a rundown of the points real quick. As I said, we get allocated amount of 10 points, but we get 3 bonus points. Each of us gets 3 bonus points that we can give to each other for whatever reason we see fit. So last episode, Boroff, you got 2 bonus points, one from Zach and I, so you have 12 points plus 3 bonus points to give out. Zach, you and I have 10 points for final voting, but we each have 2 bonus points to give out. So, with that in mind, Comrade Zach, please regale us with the twisty tale of Icarus.
Okay, so Icarus is indeed a 2017 documentary film. In fact, the Academy Award winner for Best Documentary Film in that year. It was directed by Brian Fogel. And indeed, at the beginning of the film, the central figure is Mr. Brian Fogel, who is an avid biker, not in the motorcycle sense, in the self-propulsion sense.
OG.
Yeah. Who spurred probably in large part by the Lance Armstrong doping scandal, but also some Olympic doping scandals, decides to try and do almost a Supersize Me-esque experiment in which he is going to try to himself take a number of steroids and obviously substances that are banned from competitive sport, and attempt to fool basically every conceivable drug detection system that is currently used in the world, right? So he has a big, absolutely insane sort of over mountain 4-day bike race coming up, in which he wants to try and prepare by using steroid supplements. And in order to conduct this experiment, he gets in touch with a Russian scientist. And I should say, I did say Soviet Russia at the beginning. Apparently, we need to clarify this for Americans. It is currently not Soviet Russia. It is capitalist oligarchy Russia.
Correct.
So, yes.
It also should be noted that Brian tried to get other doctors to help him with this experiment, and every doctor said absolutely not. But one doctor said, but there is this guy in Russia. He's a little on the shady side. And
that man was Grigory Rodchenkov. a man who likes to Zoom shirtless, who
Skype back in the day. Yeah.
Skype at this time, yeah. Who instructed Brian on his doping regimen, right? He gets him all of the supplemental materials he needs, the steroids and whatnot. He tells him how to take them, how often to take them, and gets him involved in a pretty rigorous, I would say, doping routine. He is injecting himself with steroids, first in the thigh and then later in the butt, several times a day, an obscene amount of steroids, I would almost say. So Brian is following this. Go ahead.
Yeah, to the point he's getting like blood blisters from how many steroids he's inserting into his body, and they go down over time, but it's pretty horrifying, and they show it all on camera.
Yeah, it's quite. If you have a needle phobia, the first part of this movie might not be your favorite. Anyways, he instructs him on also tactics to avoid detection in urine. He is giving him advice like, put your urine in the fridge here, blah 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 blah, and I can instruct you how to avoid detection by basically any test that is available right now. So the two of them go off on this, regimen and gradually sort of become closer. They become friendly in many ways and chat on a frequent basis over Skype. At a certain point, they even meet in person when Rodchenkov comes out to LA for a brief period of time. And ultimately, Brian does get to his big race, in which he actually places, I think, the same or worse than he did the year before.
Worse.
In part because he has an issue with his bike on one of the days. The gear shift breaks, I believe. But in spite of noticing the effects in training of the steroids, it doesn't seem to greatly improve him. But ultimately, that all gets overshadowed because Rodchenkov lets out that there is indeed a pretty major doping apparatus in Russia, state-sponsored. And soon, with the Olympics, I believe the Sochi Olympics, the Rio Olympics coming up. Is that the one that they're on the way to? No.
That's right.
Yes,
it's the Rio Olympics. 2016 is what's coming up. Yeah.
Right. After a bit of a stir, there was a bit of a stir in the Sochi Olympics in 2014, but people start looking more into it prior to the 2016 Rio Olympics, and Russian doping becomes kind of a scandal in the media. And ultimately, Russia starts moving to get ahead of this potential scandal. And that includes sort of hushing up and cleaning up its doping operation, which Rodchenkov is a major, major, major part of. He basically runs the lab in which the doping and the testing occurs. And he did so at the Sochi Olympics, as a matter of fact, where there was a complicated system of transporting and switching out urine and, getting it out of the, tamper-proof capsules that they store it in, replacing it and putting it back in place. And he has all this information that makes him a bit of a problem for the Russian government. And it becomes clear that Rodchenkov is becoming increasingly concerned about his personal safety and his ability to basically not get murdered by Putin.
Right.
So
because his other partner dies of a heart attack.
Right.
Yeah.
Before the other person goes, he manages to work with Fogel in order to get himself a round trip ticket out to Los Angeles, but he has no intention of returning to Russia because he is of the mindset that he is in a lot of potential danger. And that seems to be accurate. They set him up at a temporary home, and while he's there, one of his colleagues, also involved in the doping process, dies of a heart attack, very coincidentally. And Rodchenkov has absolutely no trust that that was a natural heart attack. He's sure that the man was, killed. And at this time, they begin to deal with both the U.S. Department of Justice and also with certain newspapers, such as the New York Times, in order to get Rodchenkov's account of this story out, and also to find protection from potential Russian assets that might be in the United States and kind of after Rodchenkov. So we also learned that in the past, Rodchenkov has been targeted by the Russian state before. He's been to prison. He attempted suicide at one point and was put into a mental facility where he was sprung because he was deemed to be useful for this potential doping scandal based on his previous experience and studies. So basically, he lets loose all these factors. The Russian head of sport and Putin above him are all actively involved in this. They're all very, very, very nasty people who have no compunctions about killing. I believe the head of sport is a former KGB agent.
Correct.
Yeah.
The Chika or whatever.
Yeah. And he eventually gets in touch with, obviously, the Department of Justice, with whom he gives a great number of details about how the Sochi doping scandal worked and that the majority of Russian participants in that particular Olympics were probably doping. And in fact, the doping goes back to, I think, the 90s or the 80s. It's been a very long-standing thing, though it really ratcheted up after, I think, the 2010 Olympics. The Russians did quite poorly, and Putin
Though the weird thing is that it was an ongoing rumor for a very long time. I believe Rocky 3 had a whole thing in there where Dolph Lundgren was juicing, and that's why I think, a spoiler warning, I think he kills Apollo Creed with a really strong punch, and that leads to the rest of that confrontation in that film.
Yeah. But yeah, so after the 2010 Olympics, Putin felt embarrassed by the Russian performance, and they really ramped up the doping since then. Ultimately, he gets in touch at the same time he's talking to the Department of Justice with the New York Times and gives the story to them, which potentially puts him in conflict with protection from the United States government, who doesn't want this story going out in the media before they can sort of address it themselves. So a lot of this is him trying to figure out where he's going to get protection, who he can deal with, and at the same time, Russia is smearing his name as mentally disturbed, previously suicidal, using his, previous
drug addict.
Yeah,
it's a lot of trumped up charges and nonsense that they're throwing at him.
Correct. Yeah, trying to discredit this guy who's kind of the key witness in this sort of doping scandal thing. But ultimately, not only does the Times get the story, but he gets it out to the Olympic Committee, who are, sort of embarrassed by the fact that they've all been hoodwinked. But Brian Fogel is like, well, you have to imagine this guy has left his family. He's left his sister, his wife, his kids, his dog to come out here and break this story. And would you make that level of sacrifice based on bullshit claims? And ultimately, for a while, it looks like Russia might be barred from the Rio Olympics, though ultimately most of the Russian athletes were allowed to participate.
Correct. There's a interesting loophole I can get into, but
yeah. But the film ends with Rodchenkov having gotten his story out, going into witness protection. He talks to his wife one last time over Skype, saying he does not know how long he will be in witness protection, and says goodbye to Brian, who sends him off at the airport to places unknown. There's been, at this point, even a second one of his colleagues has died over the course of this scandal. And he heads off to God knows where, witness protection, where he remains to this day. And that's more or less the story of Icarus. It's our first documentary on this iteration of the show. I don't know if we ever did one on the old.
Wait, I think we did the one or two.
We did the dolphin.
We did like a whole episode. Yeah, the Cove. I think we did like a whole episode chunk of
I think that was before I joined.
Yeah, it was and I think we were still trying to figure out what we were doing. But yeah, no, and that's why I kind of chose this movie, because I had seen it before when it was on Netflix before it won the Oscar, and I was fascinated by it because one of the reasons I was really, really taken with it is how the movie slowly but concretely changes. Like, at first, as Zach said, it's like this kind of Supersize Me experiment, kind of like a Roger and Me first-person account of what would happen if I tried to do Lance Armstrong's shit. And then when it does change, the second half of the movie is separated by the placards of O'Brien's speech from George Orwell's 1984. And once that first placard comes up, that's when I'm like, I'm in a different fucking movie. Like, this is a completely different movie. And I was struck by that when I watched it for the first time. So when you suggested this thing, it was the first movie that came to my mind was this movie.
I think it's one of the fascinating aspects of this, in terms of this particular topic of movies that shift in the middle, is obviously with most films that would be an intentional choice. In this movie, events just happened around this guy that he was already in touch with to do this completely. The original conception of this movie, probably the arduous mountain race would have been the climax of the film, and they'd be like, oh, he got away with it, or he didn't, or he did better, or he did worse. But very quickly, the entire like beginning part becomes backstory. Like, it's becomes overshadowed so completely by this guy who is in danger of being killed by the Russian government.
Yeah. What I was what I was nervous about picking this film, because I was worried when that shift happened, if it happened too early. But, you know, because like when I was watching it again for the podcast, I noticed that we meet, you know, Gregory like almost in the first 15 minutes. But it isn't until about minute 42, 45 when everything changes to be like almost this spy thriller sort of thing.
It does a perfect thing. Basically, when the midpoint hits, that's when it turns into a different film, and it's pretty fantastic that they edited it together in that way and told the story that way. I had the same reaction. Not to tip my cards too much, but this is probably one of my favorite documentaries now, having seen it. For me, like, I always had this thing, and I think, Carlsen, you heard me like complain about this. It was a common thing in film school, of the question of Morgan Spurlock versus Errol Morris, and that seemed like the two tiers, of like super subjective or super objective, and in the middle,
or Michael Moore could be
Michael Moore, exactly.
Michael Moore's probably
absolutely,
I think I remember more in film school. It's about retrospective versus perspective. Like, it's But this one kind of does both. It's weird.
It does, but it's one of these things where it feels totally justified because it does what a documentary is supposed to do. Like, it's there for an event to occur, and it's not something that the filmmaker is causing to happen. It's something that just happened because they were in the right place at the right time, and I love that.
And it's fascinating because the first half, the documentary that they're making at the beginning, the Supersize Me with steroids, Supersize Me as in literally me. That movie stars Brian Fogel. Yeah. And the movie it turns into stars Gregory. Like, Gregory very much becomes the focal point of the movie. Brian becomes such a backseat character. He's there, you know, he's trying to coordinate his living situation and help him figure out how to get in touch with the US government or various magazines. But after a certain point, Gregory, who is, you know, a supporting character in the first half, becomes the show.
Correct. And also, I think that I'd
like to give Zach a point, because that is something that I responded to strongly, because it goes from being a narrative about the filmmaker to a narrative about the subject, and interestingly enough, when you said the thing about Supersize Me, they made this documentary before. I believe it was called Faster, Stronger, Almost Dead, or something like that, where it was about a guy who was a big fan of, I think, Chris Benoit or someone, or the Iron Sheik. He was obsessed with wrestlers in the 80s. I think it was
Benoit, because Benoit was the one that, like, kind of, they blamed it on steroids, but but it wasn't.
But he was also, I think, I just remembered that the lead into it was he was really into the Iron Sheik, and he was completely confused that the Iron Sheik and Jesse Ventura were big buds off screen, because he wasn't, aware that wrestling was fake. But he got into doping and steroids, and the arc of that film, I've kind of forgotten most of it since, because it was essentially him going, steroids aren't that bad. And, like, his personal journey was like, I went from thinking steroids were bad to maybe thinking they're fine. And that's not a really deep or meaningful thing to have happen. But in this film, because of just the fact that he knew the guy who was doing the doping program, it turns into a real story that has real-world consequences. And it gets incredibly dark. And it's something we're dealing with in the news right now.
Yeah, we'd be remiss not to mention that this is a very timely pick.
Yes, sort of the reason why I picked it.
Yeah, and I feel comfortable to say, like, I don't know. I think that there's, in various areas of the political spectrum, I think that Russian propaganda has been effective enough that there's Putin apologia, but this guy's been a piece of shit for a long time, man.
No, not on this podcast. I think
not on this fucking podcast.
The one thing that I find, the one silver lining I find on this entire thing is that the entire world has kind of been convinced that Putin is a piece of shit, and we finally had something where they all were able to go, oh no, he's awful, and oh, you're going to do embargoes? Let's all do embargoes. And the sanctions that have kicked in have been pretty overwhelming. Like, I didn't think they were going to do this, and we were talking briefly about this beforehand, but I think that Carlsen, I think you may have brought up that media and how we interact with media has changed, because when Crimea happened, we had camera phones, but nobody really posted videos of it live. Like, you couldn't go on Twitter, you couldn't go on Instagram or TikTok to see an instant feed of what was occurring overseas. And in this case, it's all changed. Like, you can get up-to-date information.
Well, and also the annexation of Crimea, to bring it back to the documentary, I found it one of the lines that Gregory says, after Sochi, and they won a bunch of medals. Immediately after Sochi, he annexes Crimea and integrates another special military operation to basically make Crimea part of Russia. He says a line that it kind of cracked me up, because he said that, like, maybe if he hadn't won so many gold medals, he wouldn't have done it to Ukraine. Well, this last Olympics in Beijing, Russia didn't do that many gold medals, and he still fucking did it. So good news, Gregory. That one's not on you. That one's not on you, buddy.
And it's worth noting that he's been in Ukraine, encroaching on Ukraine for like 7 years at this point.
Since 2014.
Yeah.
He has. I'm going to do something a little pretentious right now, if that's okay. I'd like to read a quote.
What? You? No.
Oh, I know. It's hard to imagine that I would be pretentious. So, there is an ancient quote from the Roman satirist Juvenal. And I'll just read it. And it is, already long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties. For the people who once upon a time handed out military command, high civil order, legions, everything now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things: bread and circuses. So the term bread and circuses in this case is basically what we see happen in the movie. He creates a strong sense of excitement and joy around the sense of being Russian, puts out essentially gladiators to prove how strong Russia is, and rides that wave of patriotic fervor right into the battlefield, where he starts killing people. I don't know if they would be as aware of this if they had done better in Beijing, but I did see a news report where China asked them to wait on their invasion until after the Olympics.
Very much so. I mean, look, all sports are, I mean, like, one of the most popular sports in Russia is my favorite sport, hockey. The KHL is their league over there, and that's run, I mean, it's basically, they are all part of Putin's inner circle. Just to give you a hint of how much, in the middle of the Beijing Olympics, the KHL announced that this 2022 season is going to be canceled, and we are just going to jump right into the playoffs. Now, their reasoning at the time was COVID. Now we know damn well why, because teams like Finland and teams like Switzerland are going to be like, wait, what the fuck? So anyway, so Putin specifically, and this was true in Stalin's here, true in Hitler, it's true in every fucking tin pot despot. They love their
worth
sports.
Remembering, like, it's very famously, was it the 36 Olympics where Hitler was very invested in the German performance, and Jesse Owens beating him was such a slight on his Aryan.
And that was in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. So the IOC certainly paid off Hitler for that, just like we did with Sochi with Putin. And to give you an even better sense, because I remember the Sochi Olympics, the Winter Olympics, because that was the last Olympics that the NHL participated in. So I got to see all my favorite hockey players, especially my American hockey players, beat the crap out of Russia with Putin in the building. And it was very satisfying. I felt bad because the goalie was the goalie to my favorite team, the Colorado Avalanche, so I just worried that there was like a sniper ready to just like take him out if they fuck up. But yeah, this is why I love this movie so much, because it takes such a seemingly banal subject as sports and using that as a microcosm to explore totalitarianism. I mean, it's what a remarkable, you guys were talking about it earlier. It's remarkable that this guy just set out to make a Lance Armstrong sort of like experiment and then like accidentally stumble into this Russian malfeasance. And your main guy is a huge fan of Orwell. So like that irony is completely right there for you. So it's a demonstrated, because totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, fair play is not really part of the vernacular. It's not part of the deal. The system doesn't work that way. You want the illusion of fair play. You want the illusion of fair play, but it doesn't really work that way. So to kind of use this as like a microcosm of how totalitarianism infects everything that it's a part of is remarkable.
It's right there in the title. Total.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I'm curious about one thing that always kind of, it jumped out at me in the film. Rodachenkov, which I think I'm saying his name right. He was so happy-go-lucky, and he was so open about what he was doing and willing to be on camera before
now
really
you know
hit
why.
The fan for him.
Now you know why. He knew what was coming. He knew he was going to be the fall guy. He was being scapegoated by the Russian state.
But he didn't know
he was going to be the
earlier.
one that was going to get... Well, I mean, but that investigation was already kind of happening. Like, Sarah brought this up, too, and when she was... Because Sarah watched this with me as well. And she was saying, right at the beginning, like, why is this guy talking on camera about this all the time? Isn't he, like, the head of the anti-doping thing in Moscow? Why is he talking... Now we fucking know. Because he viewed Brian as a way out. You know, I think, because even when Brian, because I think what's remarkable is Brian actually goes to Moscow and like meets him there and actually gets his camera inside the fucking lab. Then, you know, and then later on you're seeing CNN barred at the gates. They're met with guards and guns and shit.
You even have a scene where they're driving up to the lab and Rodchenkov is like, you know, keep the camera hidden. Like,
yeah. So
but he doesn't tell him to turn it off. He's like,
no. Keep it low, because I think the whole time he's telegraphing to Brian that like, you're my way out, you know, like, and we can get out and get this story out. Cause I think he wanted to be a fucking whistleblower. I think he really, that's why he kind of agreed to do it. Maybe not. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, because it does seem kind of accidentally kind of happening at the same time. But they do mention in the beginning of the movie that there are these investigations happening.
I think it could be a mix. I think obviously rumblings about Russian doping were there, and maybe he was like, this is a backup plan. Like, maybe his plan wasn't necessarily to be like, I'm going to whistleblow, I'm going to flee Russia. But maybe he did see Brian as like, well, just in case.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think too. And also, I think the moment when he decided, fuck it, I'm blowing the whole whistle, is when he saw on the news report, and it's remarkable they got this, of like, you see his reaction to his colleague dying. He gets the news report about it. You see that reaction real time, and the guy turns white. I mean, he is like, he's like he saw a ghost. And he's just like, he's frenetic. It's absolutely crazy, and that's why I love documentaries like this, because it can capture real moments like this, that no matter how much you tinker or edit with, that moment exists and it was caught. And I love documentaries like that.
For me, it just seemed strange, because it did seem like he was self-incriminating a lot, and it just seems extremely odd. I just wonder if like he didn't think that it could happen, because he seems like he's legitimately upset that he's going to have to leave his wife and his dog behind. But I would also
Especially
ask,
the dog.
like,
We love that dog.
why would you not think that this could occur? Why does it seem beyond the realm of possibility that Putin would do this?
Very true, especially when throughout most of the movie, you don't even know his whole backstory of how Putin basically plucked him out of prison to do this. When you know that if he can pluck you out of prison, he can put you right back in.
Well, I mean, that's what he got. He got stuck in prison originally, basically in the mental institution through, political, like, string pulling.
Yeah.
So it just seemed odd that, knowing the possible outcome, you would still be
he got
happy-go-lucky
threatened by the Russian
about it.
state with arrest and all these things, and he attempted to kill himself. And after that occurred, they put him in a mental institution of some kind. Yeah, and then they pulled him out of there.
Fascinating.
And I think it's interesting. I think the other thing is, conceivably, this guy could have been a very dull, uninteresting dude. I found him very engaging.
Oh, Zach, I got to give you a point, because you're pretty much stealing, because I couldn't quite. I think it's one of the other happy accidents, not just in uncovering the story and this guy having this kind of metatextual context with Orwell, but the man himself is such a gregarious sort of like character that, he just loves his dog, and he's going to teach Brian's dog how to speak Russian, and like he's such a bubbly character. Like, one of my favorite lines that I laughed out loud is when they're in Moscow. He's all like, "Oh, is Moscow nice? Oh yeah, it's beautiful. I love Moscow. Are you serious? No."
No, it was peaceful. Peaceful is like the most.
Peaceful.
Moscow's
Very
the most.
peaceful.
Russia's the most peaceful place on earth.
Stress-free country in the world. Do you mean that? No.
Yeah, I think that that for me was a very telling moment, because it also is like, I think we've all had jobs or been in circumstances where it's just like you say the exact opposite of what you feel, because you've kind of resigned yourself to that it's never going to change. So why not just say something dumb about it?
Just like Orwell, you are saying what you know is not true. And it's very cool to me. I mean, like the way he is, and Brian himself, I guess I could take a little moment about him. He does seem more or less like curious, but he seems more concerned than anything else than trying to get to a story here. I think he's more or less just trying to protect his friend rather than uncover a story here. I found that pretty interesting, that yet he's still like trying to be an advocate for what Gregory's wanting to do.
I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna give Russell a point for that, because I concur with the characterization of Brian in this story. I'm also going to give one to Chris for, as pretentious as it was, his little quote and observation earlier. I do think it was intelligent and relevant.
Yeah,
but
I probably should have asked if you guys already had heard Bread and Circuses before giving the entire quote. But anyway, go ahead.
I feel like I've heard it before, but I didn't remember the context. I've heard the phrase, and I didn't know maybe the full context. I agree. I think that once, to Brian's credit, like once shit starts getting real, like the documentary is still on, but it does not seem like his primary purpose. Like, it does seem like his main thing is like, I've got to protect this guy. Like, when he's waiting for him at the airport, it's tense. Like, it's a tense moment where he's like, is this guy going to show up, or is...
Did he get detained at the airport?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, even when he went and met with the the heads of the IOC, that was a fascinating sequence because it seemed like they were immediately responding with like their egos, that their professional ethics had been offended, as opposed to the reality of the circumstance. And the fact that he was able to speak to that calmly was fascinating to me. I know you made a comment about it, but it was just...
I think he made a... And it was like he spoke to it from a perspective of clearly having an affinity for Gregory. Like, the one woman on the IOC was like, you can understand, this is very embarrassing for us. It's very, like... we have to rescind all these results. It's like, do you understand this is professionally very bad for us? And he's like, this man gave up his entire fucking life to
and is at risk of it to this day.
Yeah, he's still in witness protection.
And that,
God willing, maybe fucking Putin takes a fall from Ukraine and this guy can like get back with his family or something.
I mean, the thing is that's one of the sad
unlikely
parts of this
I know
for me.
But...
Like it's a pyrrhic
and that's
victory.
It is because like all it is, and I don't know if everybody knows this about the IOC. They're totally on the up and up and not corrupt at all. But
they're as upstanding as FIFA.
Oh, absolutely. And the NFL. Haha. Anyway, because Russian players are still allowed in the Olympics. I don't know what's going to happen after this whole Ukraine thing, but they're allowed, but not under the Russian flag. It's under the Russian Olympic Committee. So they're literally just athletes from Russia playing for the Russian Olympic Committee, which, according to the Russian Olympic Committee, they're not have any ties with the actual state. Because that's what I think is the most fascinating part about this, is that whole Sochi scheme of swapping out urine. That could have only happened with state support. Period. That operation was way too complicated for a couple of overzealous patriots to make their athletes better.
Emphatically, like they make it clear, like whatever they call the KGB now, like those were the people carrying the cases across the court to like the other lab and switching out the tamper-proof quote unquote caps.
It's
correct.
Literally a home court advantage.
Yeah, no, and they would do it in other countries if they could get away with it. And that's why I think that that scene with the Olympic people where Brian's giving his pitch is one of the most. I love that scene because that happens in real time. You watch these people's faces, just their mouths agape of just the shock of the sheer breadth of this. And then their main guy, Richard McLaren or whatever, he's a very famous like sports crime investigator or whatever. When he gives his little press conference at the end, that not only is Grigorenko wholly vindicated, he was more right than he knew. He told you where to look at, but he didn't mention anything about the marks on the vials. He didn't mention anything about it. He didn't know anything about that. How could he? But they were all there. And when he says, well, how about 100% of them? 100% of them were tampered with. Right? I mean, amazing. I mean, I'm almost impressed. I'm almost like, well, fucking well done. You know, like, Jesus.
But then you're stuck with, they know that now, but they didn't really do anything with the information.
Yeah,
they're just like,
right,
oh, gee, isn't that sad?
Right.
Oh,
I mean,
man,
Ukraine might change things. But what's more, I think one of the reasons why this is such an interesting microcosm of totalitarianism is if they are willing to go to that lengths just for sports, what do you think they'll do to you? What do you think they're going to do to the whole system to maintain power and control? It's very telling.
That's true. Like, I think that in this case, they didn't see it as just sports. They saw it as, well, the bread and circus
national identity. National identity.
To be clear, I'm going to make a small prediction, just a generalized prediction. Since we've put a bunch of sanctions in place, that is going to destroy the economy in Russia. And with that, a lot of people will become desperate, poverty-stricken, and dependent on the state for food. I bet you that they're going to keep trying to do Olympic stuff, and that some version of bread, in terms of like a stipend of food or something else that you have to depend on the generosity of oligarchs to give out, is going to take place in Russia so they can continue being in control of people's lives.
Wait, we're talking about Russia, right? That I just can't see that. I
Well,
mean, you know,
I'll say a counter thing. Like in terms of like the idea of Putin losing any degree of control, like to me, the way that it occurs is obviously I think there's a level of unrest right now in Russia that I don't think I've seen before, but I don't think it's really going to be like the people kind of thing. Like, so the last 12 czars, right? 6 of them were murdered. 5 of them were murdered by other nobles who were like, you're fucking with my money. And I think that's far more likely like to be the thing that befalls Putin than the actual people, like, you know,
maybe.
changing this system.
He's kind of, I mean, Putin's already kind of put in the safeguards to keep whatever remaining oligarchs that aren't already dead or in jail under his thumb. I mean, one tweet I read that I think is wholly accurate. When you have these oligarchs go up to Putin and say, hey, you know, I was worth $6 billion and I've lost $5 billion. What the fuck? All Putin's going to say is, would you like to keep the other billion? You know, like that's all he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that I still just think, to Zach's point, that probably will happen, that he will probably be killed by another oligarch. Or somebody else. Like,
he's
even
older
if there's a
now
one-off...
too. I mean, he's like 70.
Well, to pull a really dumb comparison here, like, one of the issues I always had in Star Wars is after they kill the Emperor, everyone acts like the Empire just goes away and there's nobody else in charge. Like, there's always a hierarchy. There's always going to be some asshole behind the main asshole.
But you understand, Chris.
You clearly did not see...
Palpatine returned. Somehow Palpatine returned. So,
God, right?
Yeah,
that was...
Yeah.
That pains me so much that film series had any sequels.
Yeah, well, boy howdy, they're not done yet. Yeah, and that's why I think that part of the reason I picked this movie was the genre shift, but it is very timely right now, just because there's another documentary that came out a couple years before this one, and that was straight up about the Ukrainian revolution against Yanukovych. It's called Winter on Fire. It's on Netflix. Very great. Real boots on the ground sort of perspective of what happened, and just how brutal Putin's puppets can be to keep their own power. And not for nothing, Yanukovych fled Ukraine, whereas Zelensky now is gonna die there, and he's gonna die with a gun in his hand.
Yeah.
Stark contrast. That's why you gotta love these. You gotta love these Stalin-type strongmen, right? They're like paper tigers, you know. Like, Stalin wasn't a fucking warrior. They gave him to steel man. He was a boring bureaucrat.
Yeah.
You know, like he.
Well,
you know.
the relocations of populace was more to create diasporas, so that you wouldn't have any one group big enough to actually confront or deal with anything. So you didn't have anybody who liked each other close enough together so that they could all rise up. And just as an interesting point, they now have Syrian fighters that they're getting to go in there after Russia has been involved in the Syrian...
owe them. They do owe them, don't they? They've got a bit of an IOU to pay back.
The other one is the Chechens, because Russia was brutal towards the Chechens, but once they stick their puppet in, suddenly they are the best friends.
And again, I think that plays into this movie a little bit. Is part of the reason why Russia is doing this in Ukraine is that, and why they did it in the Olympics, is they've done it before and gotten away with it. You know, because Putin did this in Chechnya, did it in Georgia, did it twice now in Ukraine. And when it comes to doping in the Olympics, you know, do we really think that they only did it for Sochi? Do we really think we only did it for London? Come on. You know, like, if it's been this sophisticated, if they have this system that this is sophisticated, this has been going on for a while. And not to just hang Russia, it wouldn't shock me in the slightest if they weren't the only countries doing it. Wouldn't shock me at all. And that brings me to the overall point of doping in sports in general. Now, I'm not going to get into a sports hot take radio show here, because I've heard it said that, like, you know, does it matter if athletes dope? Does in the long run, does it really matter? Like Barry Bonds, right? He's not going to get in the Baseball Hall of Fame, even though he's got, 8,000 fucking home runs. But he got busted with steroids, so should he not be in the Hall of Fame? Does that take away all the home runs? I think I don't know the answer to this question. I think it's interesting the fact that in this very documentary, the guy's doping didn't really help him all that much. So there is an upper limit to how much drugs will help you. And if you want to talk about health effects, well, I mean, depending on the sport, you're putting your body at risk no matter what you do when you're doing sports. Like you could face instant death at any time depending on the sport.
Football
so I don't know.
has a bit of a problem with the health of their players. I think it's fair to say.
I think this was the narrative finish point for Bigger, Better, Almost Dead, whatever that was. They basically had the same take where it was like, well, everything's a risk, man.
Yeah, no, and that's why. So there's a part of me, and I'm not wholly a part of this, that sort of understands that point of view. That when you're an athlete and you are trying to get yourself every possible competitive edge to win, why would you not explore that, assuming that, or now we know that the Russians are doing the same thing. But this is where you do not want this to go. This is why we have these guardrails against this kind of thing, in my opinion. I mean, like I said, other people, I don't like, because one of the major Russian athletes back then and today is a hockey player named Alexander Ovechkin. Now, Alexander Ovechkin has made no bones about his friendship and loyalty to Putin. He even had a t-shirt that said "Fuck Crimea" in 2014. His Instagram avatar is, I still believe, a photo of him arm in arm with Putin. So now, fast forward to today, where Russia is basically illegally trying to conquer Ukraine. He's having to sort of kind of waffle a little bit. Now, look, I don't expect Alexander Ovechkin to like say, well, next time I see Putin, I'm going to give him a business. You know, what's he going to do? Plus, he's still got family in Russia. What do you think is going to happen to them if you start speaking out? So that is the problem when you're dealing with a sort of authoritarian strongman like Putin. But that's why I always like the term strongman, because Putin's not. I mean, they make him think like he's James Bond and he's closer to George Smiley. He's just a fucking, it's laughable. The myth building that goes in that is required to make these regimes work is fascinating to me.
Well, it's entertaining when you see the Walmart version of that. Like, I just wanted to casually point out, you have I believe a fuck off Nazi Trump's shirt.
Nazi Trump's fuck off. That's right.
He tried to pull the same stuff as Putin for a lot of his like personal identity and branding, but when you look like an 88-year-old man who has been eating Twinkies all of his life and never doing any actual hard work, you can't really pull that off. You can't pull off being the suave.
I mean, he was moderately successful at the very least. There's a certain non-inconsequential segment of the population who fully went for it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, and it's the same thing with Putin. Because why? Because he appeals to that same sort of, well, especially with Russia, right? Because they're still kind of reeling from the fall of the Soviet Union and their glory days are behind them or whatever. So they look to a guy like Putin who is going to elevate them back to their former glory, and they're going to take back Ukraine even though it hasn't been theirs for centuries. Like it's this notion of empire, really. That's the thing. Like when you have an empire,
decades,
you're rooting for. Well, Ukraine, just because it was part of the Soviet Union doesn't necessarily make it part of Russia. I mean, Ukraine still had somewhat of a national identity. That Marx and socialism and all that. That it's the notion of national identity wasn't really worked into all that. I mean, Russia was the big brother in all of it, but Romania and all of them, they still felt themselves as Ukrainians or West German or East Germans. So, I mean, it's a bit different than saying, no, Ukraine's always been Russia, actually. We've just allowed them to be Russia. Because you see, back in the Attila Hun days, a Rus tribe took over Kiev, and that's where he converted to Christianity or whatever. And that was the birth of Moscow for some reason, even though Moscow never even existed back then. It's crazy. It's that amount of myth building that goes in. Yeah, right. Yeah, well, it's that amount of myth building that has to go into getting people to just buy your stealing, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's like, okay. So this is, I feel like, this is extremely common in authoritarian and, dare I say, generally far right like ideologies of this idea of like, you know, we have to build on the legacy of, I mean, the farther back the time that you're appealing to goes, the more fucking crazy you are, generally speaking.
No kidding.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's a big deal in why, you know, sport is so important. Like, we are the we are the strongest, most capable. Like, there is no one above us is important to maintaining sort of a nationalist, authoritarian morale.
Yeah, and that's why a mode like sports of the Olympics is meant to kind of dampen that, right? It's meant to sort of like, we could still have national pride and have competition without killing each other. That's the grand, you know, sort of high-minded idea of sports, right?
But in the small-minded nationalist petty idea, the idea is this isn't a chance to embarrass everybody who is not us.
Correct. So maybe that's a good point, because maybe we're just pouring more fuel on that fire by allowing this kind of, I'd never considered that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way that you see somebody who, like, when you engage in a debate or something like that, or even comedy works this way between people who are more authoritarian and less authoritarian, in my opinion. For people who are less authoritarian, it's a way to make clever observations, to play with words and concepts and expectations. And I think for people who are more authoritarian, it's a way to embarrass people who aren't like them. Like, the primary way comedy works for, say, the far right in America right now, in my opinion, is like lib tears. Like, that's the goal. That's the punchline. The joke doesn't have to be funny. What has to work is that it upsets people. Like, it doesn't matter about the wordplay or the structure or anything like that.
Yeah, it's the sense of control.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's true too, and that's why it's just funny that you know, this movie even exists just because that's not what they sought out to do, but yet that's what they ended up with. And it's sort of why I like documentaries. Documentaries take a long time to make, and there's a reason for that, and this is a great reason why. Because if they had just said, well, you know, he's in trouble, I guess we better turn off the camera and, you know, shelve this shit for later, you know, but they kept going, and the more you uncovered, the kind of crazier it got. And one of the reasons why documentaries still work is because of character. So, like we've already mentioned, the main character at the beginning is this, you know, bicyclist from Boulder or whatever, consulting like LA anti-aging experts and shit like that to get anybody who would help him with this crazy experiment. But then it ends up with this, like I said, kind of like political spy thriller where you're at the edge of your seat, and you're just like once that first placard comes up where he goes through the 3 stages of comprehension under Orwell by the speech from O'Brien at the end of the book, you really are like, what the fuck am I watching? Like, and then you start to think about what Orwell was getting at with 1984, about the whole concept of doublethink and doublespeak, and the hoops that you have to train your brain to make sense of the world is not only you do it on your own in nature, but can be easily manipulated. By the way,
Russell's mentioned this quote a couple times. This is the actual quote from the book of the 3 stages. There is learning, there is understanding, and there is acceptance. So those are the 3 stages specifically that the film goes through in terms of...
Yeah, and that's when it makes its kind of shift from kind of like a perspective documentary about Brian doping himself to compete, and then it kind of turns into this retrospective, here's what I did in Russia, and this is why I'm running for my life. And yeah, I think the results speak for themselves. I was thrilled when it won the Oscar, because like I saw it before it was not, because I thought this is fantastic, because this is why this theme is so weird, Borov, because it's so rare to see a movie do this and have it work, you know, and not just like randomly throw in a random
for it
plot.
To be an accident.
Yeah, for a documentary, which it would almost have to be an accident for a documentary to make it work. So the fact that it does this and does it well, because I'm not saying movies don't just throw in random shit at the end to make their movie work, but that's not really what we're talking about here.
I did see some, I was researching possible options for this, and I didn't pick this movie. for a plethora of reasons. But I did see some people claim, like, Dear Zachary does this, but I would argue that movie goes from depressing to even fucking more depressing.
Right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Because even in this movie, the tone kind of shifts, right?
Well, I would say that the difference in that is that it was a reveal, not a shift in genre, which is what makes sense. Because it's a thing where it really used it as a narrative device that was extremely upsetting. I think that's one of the only documentaries I remember crying.
I mean, powerful. It worked, but
yeah.
Yep. And I'll never watch it again. I think that, but with this movie, because at the beginning it starts.
You're in this podcast, my friend.
Yeah, I know. Shit. Welcome to the movie trap.
I didn't pick it. Don't worry, I didn't pick it.
But I think that
no Dear Zachary on the horizon.
But even the tone of this movie really changes, because the beginning with like the Lance Armstrong stuff, you know, like Gregory's kind of like everyone's sort of like having a good time. They're kind of like Gregory's more like this sort of puckish, you know, kind of eccentric scientist.
The first time he shows up and he's just utterly shirtless, yelling at his dog on the Skype call, being like, "She's going crazy, this dog." He's just this big, fat, Russian shirtless guy, like, she's jumping all around.
It is refreshing. Another way how this movie's kind of timely without wholly by accident is like the opening of the movie, even pre-pandemic days, were still just computer screens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think introducing him with dogs and just how much he loves dogs was something that it made him immediately likable as a character.
He practically would have taken. He would have taken Brian's dog with him if he.
I was halfway surprised that he didn't take his dog on the plane when he came to LA. I thought he was going to show up with a little dog in a case.
Yeah. I have one thing that is a complete aside. Did, by any chance, Carlsen, did you ever go to the Aurora 24-hour fitness? Or
no.
Okay.
You know, shocking. I did not.
It's
I
fine.
know that's surprising to hear, but
I just wanted to bring this up because it was Lance Armstrong themed, and there were bicycles everywhere on the inside and giant placards of Lance Armstrong. And I remember that one of the quotes, this is going to be a paraphrase because it's been about 15 years now, but it was one of these things where Lance Armstrong was saying, "People ask what I'm on, and I tell them I'm on my bike working out every day." Just aged really poorly once all that came out, and I think that just casually Googled in the background, and
oh my
of
God.
course,
I mean, you guys remember those yellow bracelets were like fucking everywhere, you know, like it
Live Strong.
Yeah.
What were you going to say? What'd you Google, Chris?
I just Googled it, and I just saw that 24-Hour Fitness had to like go through and rip down all of their Lance Armstrong stuff back in like 2005, because I guess it wasn't just in Aurora, it was nationwide. There was one in Texas. And there's a bunch of people in here. There's one that says like peddling a name, Lance Armstrong ruined my gym, and all this stuff that's just very funny. Not funny, but interesting to read in hindsight, because it was just people who, I guess, looked up to him as a hero and then realized that he juiced his wings.
Yeah, this is, I mean, again, this is why I any of my favorite athletes, I'm not going to lift a rock and find their political views, because I know I'm not going to like what I see.
Can I briefly say one more thing about the film?
Yeah.
I actually really like how the title works for both halves of the film. I really enjoy, like, obviously with the steroid use, it's like somebody who is juicing themselves, flying too close to the sun in that regard, like, you know, blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't betray the reveal. And then obviously, I mean, just Russia and this immense doping scandal as like so grand, so, you know, intricate and comprehensive. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Like, it works for both halves, and I really appreciate that this film has this turn in the middle, and the title works for both halves. So,
all right, you get a. I think you get a point from me, buddy. I think that's a
no, Borif. I'm gonna give him my point, because I argued with this
I'll
with
take
Sarah.
Everybody's point.
It's my last point I can give, and I do want to give it because I didn't catch it when I first watched it, but I caught it this time about Rus being the second half of the title of Icarus. being Russia. I didn't catch that until the end, and I kept wondering what I thought about that. But now, Zach, you're kind of right that like both the title works for both sides of the theme. You know, I just never caught the whole rest thing. So I will give you a point, and Borf, you can keep your 2 bonus points.
All right. Well, I would follow up
now
by
Zach
asking,
and I are out of bonus points.
I would ask,
I am? Okay, good to know.
What does Ica represent in the first half of the film, then, Carlsen?
Well, you see,
The sound you make
Lance
when you
Armstrong,
jab yourself in the thigh with a fucking needle. You go, "Ugh!"
yeah, right. Or it's when you're pedaling really hard. You know, like, yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. It all works. Cool. Before I get the sense we kind of wrap it up, but before we go, one of the things that I like about this movie is, and one of the I wish I could get like a behind the scenes sort of document. I would love to see the timeline of this production, you know, like how that even, shit. All right, grab your camera. We gotta go. You know, one of the reasons why I like documentaries is because of that. It can be a very run and gun kind of style if you want it to be. Or it could be a very much retrospective. We set everybody in a room and talk about, you know, World War II or whatever. It's a versatile mode of film. It's because I think a lot of people struggle thinking that documentaries in and of themselves are genres. And I think that that's not really true, because it's hard to compare, you know, like Errol Morris or whatever to Michael Moore, you know, like, because they're just two completely different, or like Ken Burns to Werner Herzog, you know, like it just doesn't work that way. One's 12 hours, one just feels like 12 hours. So it's one of the reasons why I was happy to pick a documentary for this particular one, not just because I've been meaning, like, I really did think about like doing a theme whenever I won back in the day as a theme for documentaries, but then I'd end up watching Dear Zachary because you guys are assholes, and, you know.
Well, I know it happens, but since we are talking about it, it seems like this might be a good time for those final thoughts.
I think that sounds like a grand idea. Okay, Zach, why don't you go first since you're picking the movie next?
Sure. Yeah, this was a really engaging, interesting, timely documentary. I will say I personally also enjoy, I don't know, I think that there is a degree of genuine success with Russian propaganda on like various social media platforms, or has been in the past. I think recently it's starting to fall apart a little bit. Funding perhaps is not coming through in the same way. But, you know, even in 2016, when like there was people on the left and the right being like, oh, Russia didn't do all that much in our election. It's like, of fucking course they did. Like, what? Of course they did. You don't have to love the United States to be like, of course fucking Putin would do this. And I don't know. It's nice to see like this timely thing of like, this guy is a fucking monster, and besides that, the movie is exceptional. I think even our conversation, like, there were levels of like how authoritarianism and totalitarianism works that I hadn't considered even necessarily while watching the movie, the myth building and things of that nature. Echoes like 14 points or whatever. I know fascism is kind of a vague connector, but there are common elements. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think the turn worked spectacularly. Yeah, I think it absolutely works in the genre shift of like type of documentary from like a personal to, even as Chris said, like about the filmmaker to about a subject change. And yeah, it was really strong, really strong. I really liked it.
All right, Chris, you go next.
I'll go ahead. I really enjoyed this film. I was surprised. I didn't expect that I would see a documentary that would sort of go right up there with the thin blue line for me in terms of documentaries that have touched on something in the real world. I don't know if this filmmaker would be able to recreate this, since this film felt like an honest-to-God accident that occurred. But I think it's fascinating that we live in a time period where technology has reached the point where something like this is possible. so that they would actually be able to tell this documentary. Like, this is a documentary that wouldn't exist before the internet.
Correct.
And the access and the verisimilitude, though I hate saying that word, of like the just maybe the verisimilitude is the wrong word. It was just fascinating to me that we were able to get a fly in the wall aspect of this deeper, darker conspiracy that if somebody just said this, I would think they were crazy or potentially a crackpot. Like, for example,
and
like
surely there's so many Russian people this happens to occasionally.
That's
that we
their
just never see.
argument. Their argument that this guy's crazy. That's Russia. That's the state.
Sorry, I shouldn't have
Gregory
interrupted.
Guy is
no,
crazy.
that's valid, because it's similar to like the point you just made earlier about the fact that the U.S. election was most likely tampered with. Like, at the time, I've always kind of been like, yeah, it seems like it's possible. But considering this documentary and considering what just happened with Ukraine, I think it's completely plausible that they would have tampered with it in just this way. And if people weren't tuned into the fact that they would be getting lied to in that way, they'd probably just accept it hook, line, and sinker. Like all the people that think that Trump is in stellar health. You know, things like that. So I just think
well,
that this
look
is
at
fascinating.
him,
Well, yeah. I just think this is a fascinating
You may not like it, but
documentary.
that's what peak performance looks like.
So I'm interested in this, and the fact that it references Orwell is completely appropriate, because as the main character in 1984, you don't always get a happy ending just because you've told the truth. It feels right and it is the moral thing to do, but that doesn't mean that it changes the system or the underlying malfeasance or laziness of common people to stand up to things like this. So I think this is a fascinating documentary, and I'm waiting to see what happens in the real world sequel happening right now in Ukraine.
Jesus. Yeah. I am just impressed with this movie as I was when I first saw it. Not just because of the timeliness of it, obviously, but it is very difficult to me, because when we talk about genre shifts, you're basically talking about two movies fused together. And this movie is that. It is two different movies that are fused together. There are connectors, but eventually you realize you have abandoned the previous movie and you are now in this movie. It's very difficult to do that well. Very, very difficult to do that well and not be obvious to what you're doing to the audience member. This movie, by the time it does it to you full on, it's too late. You know, like, oh, well, I got to see how this fucking plays out. And one of the reasons that I love this movie, and I, like Chris struggling with the word verisimilitude, I struggle to try to come up with a different adjective for Gregory other than gregarious, just because it was too close to his name. But I could, because he's such a character, and that's what good documentaries are really all about. They're really all about character and about either your main subject or the subject you're interviewing, the subject you're talking about. It's about character. And this movie, the real genre shift is the changing of characters. And both characters are pretty okay and interesting, kind of enough. And the fact that Brian Fogel had the foresight to, let's just stick with it and see where this goes, because it's in the news now and everything. But, you know, I might have some sort of inside track, might go nowhere, might not, but blew the lid on how systematic and
I'd say even beyond that, the fact that he clearly cared about this man's well-being.
Correct.
Like, the documentary is one thing, but I think his primary focus in many regards was like, I've got to help this guy who's my friend.
Correct. And it should be noted, I mean, the FBI would not have put him in witness protection if it wasn't a credible threat, if they didn't have actual intelligence that Russia is looking to kill this guy, that and have manners to do it in the United States. Like, that's something. So it's fascinating story, and I'm glad I got this theme gave me the excuse basically to do this movie, and I'm very curious to see what Zach picks for this, because it's a strong movie to beat, I would say.
Well, I would say a couple things first. Chris mentioned something about the idea of truth-telling. The movie does open with a quote from Orwell, which is, "During times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act," which is the biggest indicator of the twist, I think, in the first half of the movie, perhaps. Like that there's going to be a little more than just this sort of personal experiment aspect. But before I give mine, I think you...
Well, hold on. Let me go. I got to go down the points, but go ahead and say your point. Go say what you got to say.
No. Go ahead. Do the points first.
Well, let me go down a running of the points because we were kind today and this whole theme actually. So, Borif, you now have 13 points with 2 bonus points to give out for final voting. You got a point from Zach from your pretentious Roman quote. I got a point from Zach with no more bonus points to give out, so I have 11 points for final voting. I got a point from Zach about Brian's empathy, shall we say. Zach, you have 13 points for final voting, but no more bonus points. You got a point from Chris about the changing of the subject and how that kind of worked out. You got a point from me about how much we loved Gregory and how much of a character that guy is. And you also got a point from me about saying a lot better about the title than I originally did, even though I think the sound effects work. So, that's where we're at. So, Zach Powers, round 3 of genre shifts. What have we got?
So you said you had 2 guesses for what I will pick, and I think there's a good chance you'll pick it. Okay. Why don't you tell us what your 2 guesses are?
Oh man, okay. All right. I think you're either gonna pick Bone Tomahawk or Barton Fink.
It is not either of those.
Okay,
All right. I have seen both of those, and I enjoyed them to varying degrees, both of those movies. But no, I am going to go very classic, very, like... and I don't know if both of you have seen this. I'll bet Chris has. Russell, maybe? I think I'm going to go Audition.
Oh, yeah. We watched it for the film Concussion.
Oh, you did? I was not part of the show.
Yeah, we watched it. Yeah, oh yeah, no, it was the early days of Film Concussion, and I haven't seen it since, so it works for me.
Yeah, it works for me too. I haven't seen it in probably 12 to 15 years. It used to be.
I have seen it once before too. Also, about 12 or 15 years ago. Also, maybe when I was in high school or something like that. It was one of the 2 that came to mind immediately when the topic came up were Audition and Psycho. And I was like, I've done Hitchcock. Let's do a foreign film.
Yeah. Audition should be fascinating.
I think Audition works a little bit better than Psycho, in my opinion, because I think that the genre shift in Psycho happens a little too early for my taste, for it to be an actual shift. Because, yeah, the whole thing with Marion, but then really it's about Norman and shit, really within the first 15 minutes.
Yeah, like, that's a fan.
Oh, I think it's longer. It's a little longer than that, I feel like. But yeah, it's...
Okay. It's not a particularly long movie, but... No, I'm excited. Like I said, we've covered it before. It'll be great to give a fresh pair of eyes, and maybe Borf will dig into the old archives and pull out the old Film Concussion episode. I'm sure it's out there.
Yeah, I'm sure that I say something offensive in it accidentally.
Oh, I know I did. Okay, all right, well, that will conclude the genre shift theme. And yeah, this is a very appropriate choice for the genre shift theme. And I'm kind of excited to see it because it's been a minute in my, I've got about a decade's worth of pot residue to dig through.
And viewers watching along at home, just so you know, for a lot of people, this is kind of an intense one. So, just if you are someone who likes to watch along, just be forewarned.
Oh yeah, it is definitely an Asian horror film. That should be enough for you to grasp what you're about to sink your teeth into.
It's came out right before Hostel and the rest of them, and I think inspired most of those films. So,
and I think it's better than those movies.
It is better than those films. But in terms of the level of gore and horror, this was Takashi Miike in his most extreme, outside of I think Ichi the Killer. So yeah, it's a ride.
Visitor Q is no picnic either, but yeah.
But at least that one has a happy ending.
Unlike the last 2 movies we've watched, which, both movies end up with a guy being dragged off in a car. No mobsters tripping you this time, Borif. I'm sorry. Alrighty, well, this has been fun, and do tune in to us next time when we watch Audition for the conclusion of our genre shift theme, where we will have voting and a brand spanking new theme. So, thank you everyone for joining us. It has been a pleasure as always. You can find us everywhere. We're on YouTube. We're on all the other podcast places, wherever you get your ivermectin information. Do tune in, like, subscribe, comment. We're nice folks. We like talking back. And if you're Russian bots, bring it on, bitch.
We could use the followers, Russian bots. Hit us up.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Hey,
We'll change our tune. We'll change our tune on Putin.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. As soon as we're sponsored by Russian petroleum, then we'll be like, Ukraine really shouldn't be Russia.
Tulsi, get in here. Get in here, Tulsi. We'll flip
Glenn
it up.
Greenwald, let's go, buddy. All right. Okay, so with that in mind, thank you very much. I have been Russell Carlsen, and I've also been joined by my teammates and co-host Chris Boroff.
Dope early, dope often.
And I've also been joined by my equal co-host and equal co-partner, Zach Powers.
The fucking dog is going crazy.
Alrighty. Dos Spadania, everybody. And as we always say, Diane Ladd is too young to play Chevy Chase's mom.
Movie trap promise.
Movie trap. Oh, look at that.
I almost said film concussion. Oh, going back. All right.
See you guys.
This is my body, and I can do whatever I want to it. I can push it, study it, tweak it, listen to it. Everybody wants to know what I'm on. What am I on? I'm on my bike, busting my ass 6 hours a day. What are you on?